Howard Pyle was born in Wilmington, Delaware in 1853. His Quaker family were fairly affluent, and in childhood he was privately educated, where he revealed talent for both drawing and creative writing. He was otherwise a fairly average student, but his family, and particularly his mother, who was herself a painter, encouraged his creative side, and he went on to study art for 3 years at the studio of F.A. van der Wielen in Philadelphia. Other than a few lessons subsequently taken at the Art Students League of New York, this would be the sum of his formal training. In 1876, at the age of 23, he visited the island of Chincoteague off the coast of Virginia with his father, and this trip inspired him to write and illustrate a piece for Scribner's Monthly. Not long after, on the back of this initial promising start, he left for New York to pursue an illustration career, but found the going considerably harder than he had hoped for. But he took advice when it was generously offered by successful slightly older illustrators such as Edwin Austin Abbey and A.B. Frost. And in 1877 he created a few rather unpromising cartoons for Scribner's. But most significantly, in 1878 he had a double-page spread published in Harper's Weekly, for which he was paid the unexpectedly generous sum of $75, now worth about $2,200. Following this success, more similar commissions from several popular American publications began to come his way in ever-increasing numbers as he grew ever more confident and his technical abilities improved rapidly. And by the time he returned to Wilmington to visit his home only 4 years later in 1880, he had become an established professional illustrator. Like everyone else of his generation, Pyle's work had to be engraved for reproduction from his monochrome gouache paintings, and they undoubtedly lost definition and visual personality in the process. In the early 1880s, Pyle also started to illustrate books, many of which were for younger readers. The first of these was The Lady of Shalott, published in 1881, which featured a series of atypical images printed as colour woodblocks, the same oriental printmaking process used by his British contemporary Walter Crane. In the same year he published more using the same technique, although this time with more humorous intent, to illustrate the song Yankee Doodle. But this was a method he never subsequently returned to, and the images from these projects bear little if any resemblance to any of his other work. It was also in 1881 that Pyle married Anne Poole, and the couple would go on to have 6 children. A year later, his visualization of the story of Siegfried, written by James Baldwin, was published, and he created a body of suitably rousing monochrome imagery to enhance this dramatic Nordic tale. In 1883, Pyle published the book The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood. It was essentially a rewrite of several other early accounts of the legendary character and his exploits. In this instance, the images were drawn very much with the wood engraving process in mind, and Pyle utilised its limitations and posed his characters quite formally to create illustrations of plausibly medieval qualities. It was immensely popular at the time and is now considered a classic of its kind, which arguably set the stage not only for N.C. Wyeth's later more naturalistic colour edition, but the many Hollywood movies that followed in later decades. Pepper and Salt, or Seasoning for Young Folk, was published in 1886, and this book provided Pyle with the opportunity to create more comedic line-only illustrations for children, which took many forms of layout, but all of which worked harmoniously with the nostalgically styled text. And the evidence clearly showed that, like his more serious work, this aspect of his talent had also become considerably more confident and expressive than his earliest published attempts at humour. This was further demonstrated in 1888's The Wonder Clock, with verse composed by Pyle's sister Catherine. The tales in this book were rewritten versions of European folk tales, some courtesy of the brothers Grimm, and Pyle illustrated them with a series of particularly confident and appealing line drawings, and among other tales involving well-observed human characters, this book also revealed a previously unseen talent for anthropomorphic character design. In the same year he published his own first novel, the adventure story Otto of the Silver Hand. This was another medieval tale with more than its share of romance and excitement, set in 13th century Germany. And both Pyle's writing and the quality of his illustrations made the book an immediate and enduring success, which has been reprinted many times since its first publication. And although it had already been published sequentially in the previous year in Harper's Magazine, the pirate tale The Rose of Paradise was also published in book form in 1888. Sadly, the images created for this story suffered greatly from translation to engraving and far from ideal print quality, a fate suffered by many book and magazine illustrators in this period. In 1889, he and his wife sailed to Jamaica for a well-earned break, leaving their children in the care of relatives. But tragically, while they were overseas, their son Sellers died unexpectedly. Possibly because of this family tragedy, it was another 3 years before he published more books, and he appeared to be making up for lost time. In 1892, Pyle published another of his own rousing adventure novels, Men of Iron, this time set in a well-researched if romanticised version of 14th century England. His own fascination with historically distant and heroic stories was matched by that of his enthusiastic readers. The frontispiece was printed in chromolithographic colour and gave a glimpse at least of the true quality of his painted work. Unfortunately, the page illustrations were monochrome yet again and not very well printed. In the same year he wrote and illustrated A Modern Aladdin, which featured a series of highly expressive and considerably more gestural than usual vignetted monochromes. I can find no definitive proof of it, but it looks to me that this may have been the first example of his pen and ink work being reproduced photolithographically. These images were certainly possessed of considerably more lively expression, and it was around this time that this method of bypassing the engraving process was becoming more widespread. In 1894, he started teaching illustration at the Drexel Institute in Philadelphia, and in that role he helped a large number of younger American illustrators launch their own careers. But his role as a teacher didn't noticeably interfere with his remarkably prolific output. Only a year later, Stops of Various Quills, written by William Dean Howells, was published, featuring a series of medievally styled line drawings by Pyle. And there were also a few compelling painted illustrations, which sadly were only printed in half-tone monochrome. And in the same year, Pyle illustrated Twilight Land, a collection of fairy tales from around the world, which was crammed with more similarly gestural monochromes dotted throughout the text as vignetted spot illustrations. This collection was a triumph of expressive but agreeably spare pen and ink work, which succeeded as much through what Pyle had left out as what he included in these illustrations. In a continuing display of productivity and creative energy, 2 more books were published in that year. Both the story of Jack Ballister's fortunes and the fantasy tale The Garden Behind the Moon were illustrated with painted illustrations, once more begging to be reproduced in full colour. In 1898, he was one of a handful of others commissioned to illustrate the story of the Revolution by Henry Cabot Lodge, and his contribution was significant. And evidence in the form of this colour painting indicates by this point, even though printed in greys, Pyle was producing the originals in colour, presumably to enable him to sell them as art. Even as he engaged in this remarkable volume of book illustration and even occasional writing, Pyle continued to keep his magazine clients happy with an equally improbable volume of narrative illustrations on their covers and pages. And by this time 1 or 2 of the magazines were actually making tentative steps towards using colour printing, which was prohibitively expensive at the time. But even the monochrome work was benefiting from far more sophisticated print production of greater clarity than in his early career. In 1900 he stopped teaching at the Drexel Institute, but established his own art school in Wilmington, Delaware at his home and studio, and there he taught a small number of students, helping once more to develop the talents of future successors. The story of King Arthur and his knights, published in 1903, saw a notable return to formal, deliberately medievalist styling, similar to his earlier success with Robin Hood. Like all versions that I'm aware of, Pyle opted to depict what was a legend about 6th century England as if quite a few centuries later, with armour and other props and chivalry generally associated with the 11th century and the times of the Crusades. But his readers didn't care about historical inaccuracy, and the popular success he enjoyed with this book was so considerable that it led to 3 more in later years. In 1903, Pyle also began work on a series of murals to be hung in his own home, and such was the scale of this undertaking it took him 2 years to complete them. But he continued to simultaneously work on all his other projects, and a year later his gouache-painted illustrations for a book about the life of Joan of Arc was published, and this time they were reproduced in full colour. And while the print quality wasn't as good as it might have been, they gave a much clearer indication of his painted prowess than those reproduced in grey. In 1905, the book One Horse Shay was also published in full colour, but these were more comedic, fine linear pen and ink drawings, with added quite bold washes of watercolour using an earthy palette, and as such were a distinctive and engaging alternative to the full colour painted work. The same year also saw the publication of the second of his Arthurian tales, with the Champions of the Round Table, following the same successful format as the first. Pyle returned to large-scale painting in 1906 and painted the Battle of Nashville in St. Paul, a remarkably detailed and dramatically composed canvas 8 feet wide. In 1907, Henry Peterson's novel Dulcibel, about the Salem witch trials, was published with a collection of atmospheric full-colour paintings by Pyle, using a restrained desaturated palette with great success. In the same year, Pyle's own book, a collection of pirate stories titled Stolen Treasure, was illustrated with only a handful of fairly muddy halftones and some oddly casual pen and ink vignettes. Sir Launcelot and His Companions, the third in the ever-popular Arthurian series, was also published in that year. And in 1908, another Pyle-authored book, The Ruby of Kishmoor, featured a full-colour frontispiece, but the pages only had some less visually engaging limited-colour vignettes. His productivity remained constant as the second decade of the century grew closer, with a run of illustrated fiction published in Harper's. And in 1909 he even dipped a toe into theatrical costume design for a now-forgotten Broadway musical titled Springtime. In 1910, Pyle created this breathtaking painting as another decorative wall panel for his home, and the same year saw the publication of the last of his Arthurian series, titled The Story of the Grail and the Passing of Arthur. It was also in 1910 that he and his family sailed to Italy, where he planned to study the paintings and sculpture of the old masters. But by this point his health was quite poor, and in 1911 he died from a kidney infection in Florence at the age of only 58. In 1921, a full decade after his death, Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates was published. It proved to be very popular and continues to be to this day. This was the first time many of the painted illustrations he had created in previous years for books and magazines had been published in full colour from the original artwork. We now tend to take the look of these characters as wholly authentic, but the truth is that Pyle added romanticised embellishments of his own, as few examples of how they really looked, either actual or drawn, existed for him to use as reference to work from. It's also a great pity that during his lifetime so many more of his painted works in books and magazines were not printed in colour. But at least more than a century after their creation, we can now see and appreciate many of them as they were originally created. Pyle's crucial position in the pantheon of early giants of illustration can't be disputed. It's recorded that he was fond of advising his students to throw your heart into the picture and then jump in after it. And it's no real surprise that he is now remembered almost as much for his work as a visual educator as for his own vast seminal body of illustrated and written work.